Hello YouTube, and welcome to a bit of a different lore video than usual. Today I'm going to cover what in my opinion are some of the more important lore questions that remain unanswered after playing Skyrim and in extension the Elder Scrolls Legends and the Elder Scrolls Blades. I'm not talking about the big stuff like was the Emperor assassinated or the Dark Brotherhood destroyed or who will win the Skyrim Civil War, as everybody by now knows those dilemmas and people have covered them and beat them to death everywhere online. But today I want to talk about some of the smaller lore dilemmas that are quite important that we still got after playing Skyrim, Blades and Legends, but which could be vital for the Elder Scrolls 6's storyline. So, alright, let's cover that. Alright, so the first question, and immediately also in my opinion the most important one, is what is the true goal of the Thalmor? With Bethesda sort of building them up as likely the overarching villains for the Elder Scrolls 6, their motivations will be a game changer in the way the Elder Scrolls 6's story will handle the Thalmor, and will probably impact the story altogether if they play the role as a primary or perhaps again as a secondary antagonist. Now, the main two theories on their motivations are essentially built upon conflicting sources and an unreliable narrator dilemma. You see, one part of the community thinks that their goal consists of getting elvish political dominance back on the continent, making humans once more the secondary race on Tamriel, something which hasn't been the case for several eras at this point. People who followed my channel for a while will know that I'm personally a proponent of this theory, but I have come around a bit on the second one, or at least I've gotten a bit more nuance on the second one. The second theory suggests that their goals are far more sinister and that they wish to unmake the mortal plane, so in simple terms, destroy the world as we know it and reshape it in whatever image they see fit. The main argument of this theory is derived from a quote by Ancano of the College of Winterhold questline, who essentially shouts, "I have the power to unmake the world at my fingertips," when he's usually utilizing the Eye of Magnus during the college questline. This seemingly confirms several unlicensed sources of the Thalmor wishing to unmake the world and turn it back into a state where they can completely reshape it. However, considering the unlicensed nature of those texts, that's something I'm personally always very careful with, as Bethesda can contradict those texts if they wish, and they have contradicted sources from those kind in the past. Thus, I am personally inclined to say that Ancano's quote was merely a boast and not really connected to a larger goal. But they specifically did include that wording of unmaking the world in the final game Skyrim. And the man who wrote some of the unlicensed sources, Michael Kirkbride, has worked for Bethesda in the past, and every so often they have used his texts that he wrote after leaving Bethesda. So the door to this theory being true is still very much open. However, the text he wrote on the subject was specifically written not in such a way that it's a Thalmor document. So as my friend Aramithius, who is an expert on these kind of texts, suggested in his podcast on it, the text might not have even been written by the Thalmor or with approval of the Thalmor. So the honest answer is that we just don't know. But then another argument for this theory is that the Blades, the organization which at the time of the Thalmor's inception no longer worked for the Empire and took a neutral role on Tamriel, did see the Thalmor as such a big threat to the world that they were willing to break their neutrality and work with the Empire again to stop them, something which suggests that the Thalmor are likely a bigger threat than most suspected at this time. So while I'm personally not a proponent of this theory, it's still very viable. But at the same time, in official Bethesda released novels, the Elder Scrolls novels Lord of Souls and Infernal City, which take place during the early stages of the Fourth Era, when the Thalmor had only just taken Valenwood and were far from the dominant force that they are now. In those novels it's stated by a Penitus Oculatus agent, which is the Empire's secret service essentially, that the Thalmor wished to bring about a new Morethic era, or an era of elvish dominance. While this seems clear-cut, since it's licensed material, it again isn't, because as with a lot of things in the Elder Scrolls universe, we're working with the unreliable narrator problem, where we don't know which narrator is speaking the truth, as both have their motivations and backgrounds. Ancano, for example, in this quote in the game, could be boasting about the powers that he now has. Or he could be talking about his own desire to unmake the world instead of that of his superiors in the Thalmor. At the same time, the Penitus Oculatus at the time of the Elder Scrolls novels might not have fully spied the Thalmor's intentions yet, and the agent in the books might have been working with outdated information. It's also possible that both are true, considering there's over 100 years between Skyrim and the novels, and thus the Gall of the Thalmor might have changed their goals, although this is a bit unlikely, as every Thalmor that we speak to essentially emphasizes that due to their long lifespans, they work on the long term instead of the short term, so I suspect that whichever plan it is, strategical and political dominance or reshaping the mortal plane, it probably hasn't changed since the start, and since we have no idea as to which theory is true at the moment, this remains a question that could be very influential for the story of the Elder Scrolls 6, but remains unanswered as of now. As a bit of a side note, I will put Aramithius' podcast on the more metaphysical side of this and the whole theory of the Thalmor reshaping the world in the description of this video in case you're interested in that. Yeah, he's far more of an expert on those kind of texts than I am, so I'd say listen to that. He has some very interesting stuff. The second very important question for the Elder Scrolls 6 that hasn't been answered since Skyrim, in my opinion, is Hammerfell Situation. Hammerfell is a human province, but it was made independent of the Empire after the Great War and after it refused to give up the fight against the Thalmor and sign the peace treaty. After this, Hammerfell, with the help of Imperial deserters, managed to fight the Thalmor to a standstill and signed their own peace treaty, the Treaty of Trosmokai, 5 years after the White Gold Concordat, which is of course the treaty that forced the Empire to outlaw Talos worship after the war in exchange for the return of their lands and possible war reparations paid by the Thalmor. However, Hammerfell was in the end not part of this treaty. We don't know Hammerfell's situation at the moment. We do know from one book, Flight of the Thalmor, that Hammerfell is still independent, or at least parts of Hammerfell are still independent. And we know from the Elder Scrolls Blades that some Redguard kingdoms in the region, like Rihad, are likely quite close allies with the Empire due to the befriended nobility. And from the Skyrim quest In My Time of Need, we know that likely the kingdom of Taneth is not very big fans of the Thalmor, if Kamatu was right, which I think he was. But other than that, we don't really know an awful lot about the province, and that's important, as for one, the Elder Scrolls 6 might take place in the province, as Hammerfell is a very popular speculation that that's where the Elder Scrolls 6 takes place. I'm personally also a fan of that theory. And second, Hammerfell is a deciding ally for the Empire and potentially an independent player in a second Great War against the Thalmor. Hammerfell's political situation could be a deciding factor in a second Great War, and the contents of their treaty with the Dominion, the second Treaty of Trosmokai, could also be vital for the story of the Elder Scrolls 6. For example, if that treaty gave away parts of Hammerfell to the Dominion that we don't know about, we might see a division between Dominion lands and Hammerfell-controlled lands in the Elder Scrolls 6. Something else we don't know about them is how they actually fared during the First War, because the exact wording in the games is that Hammerfell fought the Dominion to a standstill. This could mean that their 5 years of war after the Empire's war with Thalmor ended consisted of a static World War I-like trench war, or it could mean that they managed to push the Dominion partly out. You might not think that this is significant, but it very much is, because Hammerfell's desert troops barely stopping the Dominion in the desert and fighting them to a trench standstill means that Hammerfell is significantly weaker in terms of military strength than when they pushed the Dominion out completely. And that kind of outcome really influences the relationship between the Empire and Hammerfell and the Dominion and Hammerfell, because it changes so much about the military strengths on the continent and whether Hammerfell could truly be independent in the Second Great War. We don't know which one it is, as the exact wording in all release material says that they fought them to a standstill, not that Hammerfell won the war. And all of that taken into consideration, we haven't even talked about Hammerfell's internal politics. The province is forever divided between the two factions, Crowns and Forebears. They had an alliance during the end of the war, but does that alliance still stand 30 years after the war, or have they gone back to distrusting one another or even civil warring, because that's what they were doing before the Great War? Because if you see how the Thalmor meddle in Skyrim's politics, you bet that they will do the same to Hammerfell, and they will try to instigate as much conflict as they can between the human factions in the province, the Crowns and the Forebears. And thus, the Thalmor might have caused for internal strife there as well. All these things and more about Hammerfell will be a deciding factor for the next war, and if the Elder Scrolls 6 takes place in Hammerfell, it could have direct consequences for the game's setting in terms of story, which is quite likely that it takes place there, because it's one of the most popular speculations based on the small teaser that we've got from the Elder Scrolls 6. So yeah, I honestly don't know. And the third question is in a similar vein as that of Hammerfell, as the third question is, what is the current status of Orsinium, which is the Orcish homeland? If it's still there, and if it is still there, What's the political situation in Russianium? A while ago I made a video on Russianium, and there I go over the entire history of the Orcish city-state, so if you want to know the entire history of the Orcish homeland, watch that. But in short, the Orcs are the only race without a province to themselves, but for periods in history they've had their own city-state, or even small countries in the mountains. This country, or city-state, was always called Russianium, and it has often laid in the mountainous regions of High Rock and Hammerfell, and as such has often been part of imperial empires. But it has also more often than not been raided by the kingdoms surrounding it. For example, High Rock's kingdoms have often raided and destroyed Russianium for glory or war spoils, and as such, Russianium has often switched locations after the previous one is burned down. The most recent Russianium in the 4th era lays in the mountains between Skyrim and Hammerfell, but supposedly on the Hammerfell side, as we're not able to visit Russianium in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, only small Orcish strongholds which are in the province. This Russianium, which is currently in those mountains between Hammerfell and Skyrim, came to be after the Empire was in chaos at the beginning of the 4th era, when there was no Emperor and the ruling High Chancellor was assassinated. The kingdoms of High Rock and Hammerfell took this opportunity of chaos to raid Russianium and destroy it, since the Empire could no longer effectively protect it at this point. Imperial legions that were still in the area then joined the Orcs on their own initiative and saved many from the battle, saving most of the Orcish population and protecting them against the onslaught of the High Rock and Hammerfell troops. But the Imperial troops without reinforcement couldn't prevent Russianium's destruction. The Imperial troops then escorted the Orcs to the mountains between Hammerfell and Skyrim, where they allowed the Orcs to build a new Russianium closer to Cyrodiil and under Imperial protection most likely. But other than this, we have heard nothing, nada, of what became of Russianium. We know for a fact that the Orcs make up a large part of the Imperial Legion at the border between the Altmerry Dominion and the Empire, as they are a large and effective part of the Imperial Vanguard and fought during the Great War on the Empire side, so that probably means that Russianium is still part of the Empire, or at least under Imperial protection, like a client state kind of situation. But with Russianium right now being on the Hammerfell side of the border with Skyrim, we don't know the situation of Russianium after Hammerfell became independent. It's possible that Orcs remained in control of the mountains and thus they might still be part of the Empire or are a separate region as a client state, or they might be a completely separate region which is now independent from the kingdoms of Hammerfell, or they might now fall outside of Imperial protection and they might have been destroyed by the Hammerfell kingdoms, meaning that the Orcs are still part of the Imperial army, but that those Orcs now don't come from their homeland of Russianium but from the smaller strongholds across the Empire. We simply don't know what happened to Russianium, we don't know what its status is. But it would be cool that, for example, if Hammerfell is the location of the Elder Scrolls 6, that we might see an Russianium as an Imperial aligned separate kingdom that we can interact with, or its own independent thing among the kingdoms of Hammerfell. Or maybe we will just find its ruins if the Elder Scrolls 6 takes place in Hammerfell and it was destroyed, which I think would be a bit sad, to be honest. But the reason this is so significant is that Russianium's Orcs have often been a decider in terms of military strength. If Russianium is still part of the Empire and the Orcs are still part of the Empire's legions, which is quite likely as the Empire were the reason that they could make another Russianium in the first place and the Orcs and the Imperials have always been pretty good friends, then that means that the Empire is again significantly stronger than without those Orcs. These kind of questions make it hard to do a definitive say on, for example, the power division on Tamriel right now, because we don't know what the relationship between the Orcs and the Empire is, or Hammerfell and the Empire for that sense. And thus it's quite hard to say on how well or how bad it will go for both the Empire and the Dominion in their next battle against one another. So yeah, these kind of questions make it hard to speculate on the situation that we'll find in the Elder Scrolls 6. For example, another big question is whether Morrowind is still part of the Empire or not, but we have no new information on that one since I made my original video on that question, so I'll simply put the video on Morrowind's current situation and the speculation on that in the description of this video. But those kind of things make it really hard to accurately predict what kind of situation we'll find Tamriel in the Elder Scrolls 6. If Elder Scrolls 6 will even be after Skyrim, it could also be that it's somewhere before Skyrim, for example, it takes place somewhere during the 4th era, or maybe they go back to the 3rd, 2nd or 1st era. But yeah, those are some of the questions that personally bug me very much, and that have over the years posed some very interesting limits on what I could speculate on when we were talking about the future after Skyrim. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a bit different than usual. Yeah, it's not really a returning format, it's just one of those things which I wanted to get out of the way. since I really wanted to talk about this for a while now. Hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, before I end this video, allow me to vocally thank my top patrons who make videos like this possible. Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Sword of Bushido, and Mr. Christmas. These wonderful people, along with all the others on screen, make my weekly lore videos possible, and for that I am very grateful. That said, I will start working now on the next regular lore video, which will probably air coming weekend. I will see you all then. Bye bye.